Reality is Not What It Seems, The Journey to Quantum Gravity by Carlo Rovelli. Carlo Rovelli is a physicist, and he is a really smart guy. In the introduction, he says, I wrote this book because I wanted to explain to someone what the nature of the universe was. He has many decades thinking about this particular subject, so I think this book came very naturally and very easy for him. He starts off by talking about how we got from ancient Greek civilizations where your life is just around your farm and that's all you think about, to how we as a civilization started thinking about the universe, the cosmos, how we started looking at the structure of atoms and quarks, and how the universe began, because it seems like quite a jump. But the beautiful thing is that there's really no scientific facts that are ununderstandable. Every scientific fact has a historical story behind it, where you can see the pieces that led to the current science that we have. It's a beautiful thing. If we're talking about things like loop quantum gravity, it may seem completely incomprehensible, but really it's just a really high mountain, and to get to a really high mountain, you just take all the small accumulation of steps. And that's the history of science. It leads you up a really tall mountain by just the little steps that humanity took to get there. So he starts back at Anaximander in like 600 BC in ancient Greece. And that's where he starts, because Anaximander said that the Earth was just floating in space. That was it. That was the breakthrough, the change in thinking that wasn't around at the time. Because once you think of the Earth as a ball that's floating in space, then it changes your perspective. However, slightly and subtly, that was what got things rolling in Carlo Rovelli's mind. Because then you can start thinking about the moon, that's also a ball floating in space, and the stars, and then it starts opening these kinds of questions. So that's how we got the model that we have today. Then he jumps to Newton. Newton proves that the math of gravity works, is acting on us on an Earth level. That same gravity is pulling the moon around, and it all works out in his just math, which was an impressive trick in the 1600s. Of course, people after Newton wondered how you could have the Earth being attracted to the sun, like is there like a string connecting them together? And that's when we get into field theory. There's a gravitational field that attaches the Earth to the sun. So then that started field equations with Maxwell late in the 1800s. And then of course there's Einstein, which changed everything with his thoughts on the space-time continuum. Then he starts talking about the transition into quantum mechanics. And in quantum mechanics, we see things more about probabilistic states of matter instead of actual solid matter, which is very counterintuitive. Everything with quantum mechanics is very counterintuitive, but the math works out. It explains how the world is. So that's the first half of the book, basically everything I just said here, and he does it pretty quickly. But then he gets into the more mind-boggling parts. The main thing that I think that he's getting at that really stuck with me and is really mind-boggling to me is how quantum mechanics talked about everything being divisible. Classically, they knew that matter wasn't divisible infinitely. Like eventually you're going to get to something that's so small you can't divide it, and they call it an atom. So matter, is not divisible infinitely. And with quantum mechanics, energy isn't infinitely divisible. Light is the same thing. These things that seem like they're on a spectrum are actually in very small, come in very small quantities, and you can't divide them infinitely. One of the things that he gets at in this book is saying that space itself is not divisible. And I'm still wrapping my head around what that means, because the quanta of space is really, really, really small. He says in this book, if you were to take a walnut and blow it up to the size of the known universe, you still wouldn't be able to see the size of a quanta of space. It would be 1,000,000 times smaller than a walnut. I've concluded I still don't know exactly the implications of that, why that's important, but it's fascinating to hear this guy talk about it. Sometimes in these kind of books, you get a feeling for the narrator as you read it. And sometimes it's a bad thing because you just want to hear about the topic. In this case, it's a very good thing because Carlo Rovelli comes across as just an excited guy with an interesting personality, and the guy you want to just have lunch with and hear everything that he thinks about the universe. And that's really how I concluded what this book is. It is sitting down with a really interesting physicist so he can talk about interesting physicist things for a good 7 hours or whatever the book length was. So I don't think it's a groundbreaking book, but it is a lot of fun just to hear a smart guy talk about smart things. And it gives you a lot to think about too. He uses very simple examples, which he then translates to very complicated things. And sometimes I'm with him and sometimes it seems like quite a jump. That's why this is a book to reread. All in all, I give this book 4 stars. If you have any recommendations, leave them in the comments below.